A poor mother protects her children. How she did it will amaze you. Salome had little more than her name and her will to survive. A battered stove, a mattress on the floor, and a curtain instead of a door. That was her home. But to her, children, it was a fortress, a place where love meant more than comfort. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The December wind whistled through the cracks of the small apartment in South Chicago, carrying with it the scent of approaching snow and the distant echoes of holiday celebrations that Teresa Martinez could not afford. At 32, her once youthful face now carried the weathered lines of constant worry, yet her eyes, deep brown and determined, never lost their fierce spark. They were the same eyes that her 3 children, Miguel, 8, Carmen, 6, and little Nicolas, barely 4, had inherited along with her stubborn resilience. Tonight, like most nights, Teresa sat at their rickety kitchen table beneath the flickering light of a single bulb, her fingers raw from hours of sewing piecework she had brought home from the factory. The clock on the wall, a gift from Mrs. Watson next door, showed that it was nearly midnight. Teresa allowed herself a moment to massage her aching hands before continuing. She needed to finish at least 10 more dresses before morning if she wanted to make this month's rent. Teresa's gaze drifted to the corner of their one-room apartment where her children slept on a mattress they shared, huddled together under a collection of thin blankets. The sight of them, peaceful despite everything, renewed her determination. 2 years had passed since Raúl had walked out, leaving nothing but debts and broken promises. 2 years of Teresa working double, triple shifts, taking any job she could find, selling tamales on weekends, cleaning houses when the factory had no work. 2 years of her promising her children that tomorrow would be better, even when she wasn't sure herself. Mami. Miguel's voice, small and drowsy, broke through her thoughts. He stood beside her, his pajamas too short at the ankles. "What are you doing up, mijo?" Teresa whispered, pulling him close, breathing in the scent of his hair, the dollar store, shampoo she had diluted to make last longer. "I had a bad dream," he said, eyes downcast. "The men came to take our things again." Teresa's heart clenched. 3 months ago they had been evicted from their previous apartment. The memory of her children, watching as strangers carried their few possessions to the curb, still haunted her. They had spent 2 weeks at a shelter before Teresa had saved. Enough for the deposit on this place, smaller, colder, in a more dangerous neighborhood, but theirs. "No one is taking anything, mi amor," she assured him, cupping his face in her calloused hands. "I promise. Now go back to sleep, you have."
School tomorrow.
Once Miguel had settled back beside his siblings, Teresa returned to her work, needle flashing under the bulb, each stitch a silent prayer for a better future. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, decorating the grimy window pane. With momentary beauty, Teresa allowed herself to imagine, just for a second, what it would be like to not be afraid. Of the landlord's knock, of the empty refrigerator, of failing the 3 little hearts that trusted her completely. Then she pushed the thought away and continued sewing as the city around her slowly surrendered to the quiet embrace of the night. The morning arrived too soon, seeping through the threadbare curtains with a pale, insistent light. Teresa had managed only 3 hours of sleep, but she moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the day ahead. She heated water on the stove for washing and made oatmeal, stretched with extra water and a spoonful of the sugar she rationed carefully. "Mummy, Carlos at school says his family is going to Florida for Christmas," Carmen announced as she spooned the oatmeal into her mouth, her dark curls still tangled from sleep. "He says there's no snow there, just beaches and sunshine. Can we go to Florida someday?" Teresa folded a small portion of eggs, the last 2 in the carton, onto each of their plates. "Maybe someday, mi vida. Florida is very far away." But Dad said, Miguel began. Your father says many things, Teresa interrupted gently. Right. Now we need to focus on today. Miguel, did you finish your math homework? Carmen, don't forget your library book. It's due back. Nicholas, come here. Your sweater is backwards. As she buttoned Nicolas' sweater, Teresa felt the worn fabric threatening to give way at the elbows. She made a mental note to reinforce it tonight. Winter in Chicago showed no mercy, especially to those whose wardrobes consisted mainly of second-hand clothes and hand-me-downs. After dropping Nicholas at Mrs. Watson's, the elderly widow charged less than the daycare and had become something of a grandmother to her children. Teresa walked Miguel and Carmen to their elementary school. The three of them huddled together against the biting wind, Teresa's arm creating a shield against the worst of it. Remember, Miguel, wait for Carmen after school, Teresa instructed as they approached the building. Come straight to Mrs. Watson's. Don't stop anywhere, even if... She bit her lip, leaving the warning unspoken. Even if your father shows up again. Raoul had appeared 2 weeks ago, charming and apologetic, promising a fresh start. He had taken the children for ice cream without Teresa's permission, returning them home hours late, their eyes bright with sugar and false hope. The next day, he had asked Teresa for money, for a business opportunity, and when she refused, his charm had evaporated like morning dew. Teresa had seen the familiar signs, the restless energy, the too bright smile, the desperation behind his eyes. He was using again. We'll be careful, Mommy, Miguel promised, serious beyond his years. He took his sister's hand protectively. Teresa kissed them goodbye, watching until they disappeared into the stream of children entering the school. Then she turned and hurried towards the bus stop. She couldn't afford to be late for her shift at the factory, especially not now, with Christmas approaching and the heating bill doubling. The Rodriguez clothing factory loomed large and grey against the winter sky, its windows like countless, watchful eyes. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of fabrics and the hum of dozens of sewing machines operated by women just like Teresa. Immigrants, single mothers, the working poor of Chicago's South Side. You look terrible, observed Lena, who worked at the station beside Teresa's. At 50, Lena had raised 5 children on her own and now helped with grandchildren. Her hands moved with lightning speed over the fabric, years of experience evident in each precise movement. Nicholas had a cough last night, Teresa explained, setting up her workspace. I was afraid it might turn into something worse. That apartment is too cold, Lena said disapprovingly. You should talk to the landlord. Teresa laughed, a short, humorless sound. Mr. Danvers? The man would sooner spit on me than fix the heating. Besides, we're lucky he rented to us at all, with no credit history and... She trailed off, with Raoul's reputation for trouble. Lena understood without Teresa having to explain. In their tight-knit immigrant community, word traveled fast, and Raul Martinez's decline from hard-working husband to addict had been public and painful. My Eduardo has a friend who works maintenance at the Parkview Apartments, Lena said after a moment. They might have an opening for a unit. Better building, better neighborhood. The rent is a little more, but I can barely afford where we are now, Teresa said, shaking her head as she began work on her first piece of the day. Just think about it, Lena persisted. The schools there are better too. Teresa nodded non-committally, but as the day wore on and her back began to ache from hunching over the machine, she allowed herself to imagine it. An apartment with reliable heat, in a building where she wouldn't have to escort her children past addicts in the stairwell, in a neighborhood where gunshots didn't serve as periodic reminders of how precarious their safety was. The fantasy sustained her through the monotonous hours, through her supervisor's criticism of her work, too slow, Martinez, we've got deadlines, and through the dizziness that came from skipping lunch to save the few dollars for her children's Needs. By the time her shift ended at 4, snow was falling again, heavier this time. Teresa hurried to Mrs. Watson's apartment, the wind cutting through her inadequate coat. The thought of the weekend brought both relief and anxiety. No work meant no childcare struggles, but it also meant no pay unless she could get extra cleaning. Jobs. Mrs. Watson opened the door with Nicholas balanced on her hip, his small face flushed with fever. "He's been like this for a couple hours now," the elderly woman reported. "I gave him some children's Tylenol I had left from when my granddaughter visited." Alarm shot through Teresa as she took her son into her arms, feeling the unnatural heat of his skin. "Gracias, Mrs. Watson. I'm sorry, I should have kept him home." "Nonsense!" Mrs. Watson waved away her apology. "Children get sick. Miguel and Carmen are doing their homework in the kitchen. They've been very good." After collecting her older children and thanking Mrs. Watson again, Teresa hurried home, her mind racing with worry. Nicholas's breathing seemed labored, and his usual energetic chatter was replaced with whimpering. "Is Nicky going to be okay?" Carmen asked as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. "Of course he is," Teresa assured her, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "He just needs rest and medicine." But when they reached their floor, her steps faltered. Raoul stood outside their apartment door, shifting from foot to foot, his once handsome face now gaunt and marked by the telltale signs of his addiction. "Teresa," he called, his voice carrying the artificial warmth she had come to recognize as manipulation. "I've been waiting for you. We need to talk." Miguel moved closer to Teresa's side, his small body rigid with protective instinct. Carmen clutched at her coat. "I have nothing to say to you, Raoul," Teresa replied, her voice steady despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. "The children are tired. Nicholas is sick. Please, just go." "Sick?" Raoul took a step towards them, concern appearing to cross his features. "Let me see him. He's my son too." "Not now," Teresa said firmly, moving past him to unlock the door. "If you want to help, you can start by paying the child support you owe. 6 months, Raoul. 6 months without a single dollar." Raoul's face darkened. "You think I don't want to provide for my children? I've had bad luck, that's all. But things are going to change. I have a plan, a real opportunity this time. But I need a little investment. Just $200, Teresa. I'll pay you back triple, I swear." Teresa ushered her children inside, turning to face her ex-husband from the threshold. "Go home, Raoul. Get help. When you're clean, when you're working, you can see the children, not before." With that, she closed the door in his face, sliding the chain lock into place. She could hear him cursing on the other side, promises and threats mingling into a familiar pattern that she had learned to tune out. Nicholas's condition worsened through the night. His fever climbed, and his breathing became more labored. By midnight, Teresa knew she couldn't wait until morning. Bundling him in every blanket they owned, she woke Miguel and Carmen. "We have to take your brother to the hospital," she explained, helping them into their coats. "I can't leave you here alone." The emergency room at County General was crowded, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminating faces marked by various forms of distress. Teresa held Nicholas on her lap, Miguel and Carmen dozing against her sides as the hours crept by. When they were finally called, the doctor examined Nicholas with efficient movements before pronouncing his diagnosis: pneumonia. "He needs antibiotics right away," the doctor said, scribbling on a prescription pad. "And follow up with a pediatrician. In 3 days." Teresa's heart sank. I don't have a regular doctor for him. And the prescription, I don't have insurance." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "I'll give you a week's worth of samples to start. There's a clinic on Harrison Street that works with uninsured patients. They charge on a sliding scale." He handed her a card along with the prescription, "But if his breathing gets worse, bring him back immediately." It was nearly dawn by the time they returned home. Teresa settled the children back in bed, watching as Nicholas's breathing eased, slightly after his first dose of medication. Only when she was certain all three were asleep did she allow herself to cry, silent tears of exhaustion, fear, and the particular loneliness that comes from having no one to share your burdens with. Morning brought no rest for Teresa. There were still meals to prepare, clothes to wash, and an extra cleaning job she had taken for Saturday morning, the home of a wealthy family in Lincoln Park who needed help before a holiday party. She couldn't afford to cancel, not with Nicholas's medical expenses now added to their already stretched budget. "Miguel, you're in charge while I'm gone," she instructed as she prepared to leave. "Mrs. Watson will check on you. Nicholas needs his medicine at noon. I've measured it out already. If anything happens, anything at all, go straight to Mrs. Watson's." Miguel nodded, shoulders squared with responsibility. "I'll take care of them, Mummy." Teresa touched his cheek, heart breaking a little at how quickly he had been forced to grow up. "I know you will, mijo. You're my brave boy." The Logan family's home was a different world, spacious, warm, filled with expensive furniture, and the kind of comfortable excess that Teresa could scarcely imagine. As she scrubbed their spotless-looking bathroom tiles, she thought of her own apartment with its peeling linoleum and stubborn mold in the corners that no amount of bleach seemed to vanquish. "Oh, Teresa, before you go," Mrs. Logan said, as Teresa was packing up her supplies 6 hours later, "we're clearing out some things before the new year. The children have outgrown so many clothes and toys. Would you like to take a look? Perhaps there's something your children could use." Teresa swallowed her pride and accepted, knowing that second-hand gifts were better than no Christmas gifts at all. She selected a few items: a warm coat that would fit Miguel, some dresses for Carmen that looked barely worn, a set of blocks and a teddy bear for Nicolas. When Mrs. Logan insisted she also take the bag of discarded decorations, "We've ordered all new ones for this year's theme." Teresa accepted these too, already imagining how they might brighten their sparse apartment. Mrs. Logan also pressed an envelope into her hand as she left. "A little holiday bonus," she explained with a smile that was kind, if somewhat distanced by the gulf of privilege between them. "We really appreciate how thorough you are." Outside, snow was falling again. Teresa waited for the bus, the bag of hand-me-downs and decorations clutched in one arm, the envelope containing $60 unexpected dollars secure in her pocket. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps they would have a real Christmas dinner this year. Perhaps she could even buy each child one small new gift to unwrap. The feeling lasted until she reached their street and saw the police cars, their lights painting the falling snow in alternating flashes of red and blue. If you're enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Teresa's heart seemed to stop, then restart with painful intensity. As she broke into a run, the bags clutched awkwardly in her arms. A small crowd had gathered outside their building, neighbors huddled in winter coats, their breath visible in the cold air as they murmured to one another. Teresa pushed through them, fear making her movements rough and desperate. "My children," she gasped to the officer standing at the entrance. "My children are up there." "Ma'am, are you a resident?" the officer asked, his expression professionally neutral. "Yes, 3rd floor, apartment 3C. Please, my children—" "What's your name?" "Teresa Martinez. Please, officer." A second officer approached, a woman with tired eyes and a notebook in hand. "Mrs. Martinez, your children are safe. They're with a neighbor, Mrs. Watson, I believe." Relief made Teresa's knees weak. What happened? Was there a fire? "No, ma'am. There was an incident in apartment 3B. Your ex-husband, Raul Martinez, broke in and assaulted the tenant, Victor Diaz. Mr. Diaz is being treated at County General. Teresa felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Apartment 3B, right next door to theirs. Victor, a quiet man who sometimes nodded to her in the hallway but otherwise kept to himself. And Raul. Raul had been there, so close to their children. Was Raul looking for us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officers exchanged a glance. We believe Mr. Diaz owed him money. Drug-related, the female officer replied carefully. Mrs. Martinez, I understand this is difficult, but we need to ask you some questions. When was the last time you saw your ex-husband? The questions continued in Mrs. Watson's apartment, where Teresa found her children unharmed, but visibly shaken. Nicolas clung to her, his fever still present but less intense than the night before. Miguel sat rigidly on the couch, his young face set in an expression of forced bravery. He was shouting, "Mommy!" Miguel reported after the police had gone, promising to increase patrols in the area. We heard him next door, and the other man was screaming. I took Carmen and Nicky, and we hid in the closet, just like you told us to do if there was ever trouble. Then we snuck out and came to Mrs. Watson's. Teresa gathered him in her arms, pressing her face into his hair to hide her tears. You did exactly right, mijo. You protected your brother and sister. I'm so proud of you. Later, after she had settled the children in Mrs. Watson's spare room for the night, the police had cordoned off their floor as a crime scene. Teresa sat at the kitchen table with the elderly woman who had become her ally in this unforgiving city. You can't go back there, Mrs. Watson stated flatly, placing a cup of tea in front of Teresa. It's not safe. Raul knows where you live, and if he's involved with drugs again. I know, Teresa admitted, the weight of reality settling over her like a shroud. But where can we go? The shelters are full this time of year. I don't have enough saved for a new deposit, and even if I did, what landlord would rent to me now with Raul's violence following us like a shadow? Mrs. Watson clasped Teresa's, hand across the table, her skin papery with age, but her grip surprisingly firm. You remember my daughter, Anne, the one who lives in Denver? Teresa nodded. Mrs. Watson spoke often of her only child, a professor who called regularly and visited twice a year. She's been after me to move out there for years. Says the cold here is too hard on my arthritis. There's a retirement community she's picked out with activities and everything. Mrs. Watson smiled wryly. I always said no. This apartment has been my home for 30 years, since before my Herbert passed. But lately, I've been thinking she might be right. You're leaving? Teresa asked, surprised by the pang of loss she felt. Mrs. Watson had been a constant in their precarious existence, a source of wisdom and practical help. Not immediately, but soon, yes, which means this apartment will be vacant. It's rent-controlled, Teresa, has been since the 80s, if you were to take over the lease. Hope, dangerous and fragile, bloomed in Teresa's chest. But the landlord, Mr. Finch, is a reasonable man. Anne and I will talk to him, explain the situation. You've been a good neighbor, Teresa, quiet, respectful, and with me as your reference. Mrs. Watson squeezed her hand. It's not charity. You'll pay the rent just like I do, but it would give you a fresh start, somewhere Raul doesn't know about. Tears welled in Teresa's eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to surrender to emotion when practicalities needed to be addressed. It would mean changing the children's school, and it's farther from the factory. The elementary school in this district is good, better than where Miguel and Carmen are now, and there's a bus line that goes straight to your factory. I've seen the schedule on the fridge. What do you think? Should we talk to Anne? Teresa looked toward the spare bedroom where her children slept, finally safe after a day of fear. Then she turned back to Mrs. Watson, this unexpected angel in a city that had shown her little kindness. "Yes," she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "Let's talk to Anne." The next morning, Teresa returned to their apartment under police escort to collect essential belongings. The hallway outside Victor Diaz's apartment was still marked with crime scene tape, a grim reminder of how close danger had come to her family. Inside their own small space, Teresa moved quickly, packing clothes, medicines, the children's few, treasured possessions, and the documents she kept in a locked box under her bed. Birth certificates, social security cards, the divorce papers, and the restraining order against Raoul that had proven so ineffective. Before leaving, she paused to look around at what had been their home for the past year. Despite its shortcomings, the drafty windows, the unreliable plumbing, the noise from the elevated train that passed nearby, it had been a shelter of sorts, a place where she had fought to create stability for her children against increasingly difficult odds. "Goodbye," she whispered to the empty rooms, a ritual farewell to yet another chapter in their nomadic existence since Raoul's addiction had torn their family apart. That evening, Anne Watson called from Denver, her voice warm and decisive over the speakerphone, as Mrs. Watson explained Teresa's situation. Of course she should take over the apartment, Anne agreed immediately. "Mom, I've been telling you for years that you need to come out here where I can look after you properly. This is perfect timing." And Teresa, her voice softened with empathy, "I'm so sorry for what you're going through. Nobody should have to live in fear, especially not with children to protect." "Thank you," Teresa managed, overwhelmed by the kindness of these women who owed her nothing yet were offering everything. "I'll speak to Mr. Finch tomorrow," Anne continued. "He and Dad were friends, you know. I'm sure we can work something out. In the meantime, Mum, start packing what you want to bring with you. I'll fly out next week to help with the rest." After the call ended, Teresa put her children to bed in Mrs. Watson's spare room, which the elderly woman had insisted they use until the apartment transfer could be arranged. As she tucked the blankets around Nicholas, whose breathing was finally easier thanks to the antibiotics, he looked up at her with drowsy eyes. "Are we going to live with Mrs. Watson now, Mummy?" he asked, his small voice heavy with the confusion of their sudden displacement. "For a little while," Teresa explained gently. "And then we might stay in her apartment after she goes to live with her daughter. Would you like that?" Nicholas considered this with the serious contemplation of a 4-year-old. "Does that mean I get to keep playing with Señor Gato?" he asked, referring to Mrs. Watson's ancient tabby cat, who had taken a particular liking to him. Teresa smiled, smoothing his dark curls away from his forehead. "I think that can be arranged." From the other twin bed, Miguel watched the exchange with eyes that understood far more than a child of 8 should have to. "Will Dad know where we are?" he asked quietly once Nicholas had drifted off to sleep. Teresa crossed to his bed, sitting on the edge and taking his small hand in hers. "No, mijo. That's part of why we're moving, to be somewhere safer." Miguel's face remained troubled. "But what if he finds us again? What if he hurts somebody else, like he hurt Mr. Diaz?" The question pierced Teresa's heart. How could she protect her son, not just from physical danger, but from the knowledge of his father's capacity for violence? How could she preserve his innocence when reality had already cracked its foundation? "Your father has made bad choices," she said carefully. "He's sick, Miguel. The drugs make him do things he wouldn't do if he were well. But that's not your burden to carry. Your job is to be a child, to learn and grow and help me take care of your brother and sister. My job is to keep all of you safe, and that's what I'm going to do." Miguel studied her face, searching for reassurance. "Promise?" "I promise," Teresa said firmly, sealing the vow with a kiss to his forehead. "Now, sleep. Tomorrow will be better." As Miguel finally surrendered to sleep, Teresa remained seated on the bed, watching over her children in the gentle glow of the nightlight. Mrs. Watson had thoughtfully provided. Outside, the city continued its winter rhythm, cars passing on slushy streets, distant sirens, the clatter of the elevated train. But here, in this temporary haven, her children were safe, and for now, that was enough. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Anne Watson arrived from Denver, a whirlwind of practical efficiency, who immediately set about organizing her mother's relocation. Mr. Finch, the building's landlord, agreed to transfer the lease to Teresa's name, moved by the combination of Mrs. Watson's long-time tenancy and Anne's persuasive argument that Teresa represented a stable, reliable replacement. "The rent will stay the same for the first year," he explained, as Teresa signed the paperwork, her hand trembling slightly with disbelief at their good fortune. "After that, there may be a small increase, but it's still rent-controlled, so nothing dramatic." Meanwhile, Mrs. Watson had begun the process of sorting through 3 decades of accumulated possessions, deciding what to take to Denver and what to leave behind. To Teresa's surprise, the elderly woman insisted on leaving most of her furniture. "The retirement community is furnished," Mrs. Watson explained as they stood in her, soon-to-be Teresa's, living room. "And shipping furniture across the country costs more than it's worth. Besides," she patted the worn but still elegant sofa that had been her pride when she and Herbert had purchased it as newlyweds, "these old things deserve a second life with a family that will appreciate them." Teresa protested weakly, overwhelmed by the generosity, but Mrs. Watson would not be dissuaded. "Consider it rent for storing Senor Gato," she joked, nodding toward the cat, who had already established himself as a fixture in Nicholas's lap. "Anne's building doesn't allow pets, and he's too old to adjust to a new home anyway. You'd be doing me a favor, taking care of him." And so, as Christmas approached, Teresa found herself in a position she had never expected, preparing to move into a safe, properly heated apartment furnished with Mrs. Watson's well-kept belongings, in a building where the neighbors were mostly elderly couples or single professionals who kept to themselves. The rent was nearly $100 less than what she had been paying for their previous, far inferior apartment. It felt like a miracle, this sudden reversal of fortune. But Teresa knew that miracles required vigilance to protect them. She had changed her cell phone number, informed the children's school of the situation. They would transfer to their new district school after the holiday break, and filed an updated restraining order with her new address listed as confidential. Still, anxiety nagged at her as she prepared for their move, scheduled for the day before Christmas Eve. What if Raoul somehow discovered where they had gone? What if he came back more desperate than before? The police had not been able to locate him since the incident with Victor Diaz, which meant he was still out there, unpredictable and potentially dangerous. "You can't live your life looking over your shoulder," Anne advised when she noticed Teresa's distraction during dinner preparations. The two women had developed a quick rapport, recognizing in each other the practical resilience of those accustomed to solving problems without much external support. "I've arranged for new locks to be installed on the apartment doors before. You move in, front and back, and there's a security system in the building now. Mom never bothered to learn how to use it, but I'll show you before I leave." Teresa nodded gratefully, chopping vegetables for the stew with methodical precision. "It's not just Raoul," she admitted after a moment. "It's everything. This all happened so quickly. Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find it was just a dream, that we're still in that apartment, still one paycheck away from homelessness." Anne paused in her task of kneading dough for biscuits, studying Teresa with compassionate understanding. "It's hard to trust good fortune when you've had so little of it. But sometimes, Teresa, life does get better. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. The trick is to accept it when it does, and then pay it forward when you can." That night, as Teresa lay in the fold-out couch in Mrs. Watson's living room, she had insisted the children keep the spare bedroom. She found herself reflecting on Anne's words. For so long, she had carried the weight of her family's survival alone, refusing help out of pride or fear, or simply the habit of self-reliance that had developed in the wake of Raoul's abandonment. But perhaps true strength lay not in isolation, but in connection, in the willingness to both give and receive support within a community. With this thought warming her like an internal flame, Teresa finally drifted into the deepest, most restful sleep she had experienced in months, untroubled by the usual nightmares of eviction notices and empty cupboards. She awoke to the sound of hushed voices and muffled giggles coming from the kitchen. Confused, she checked the clock, 7:30 a.m., later than she usually slept. Throwing on her robe, she padded toward the kitchen, only to stop in the doorway, momentarily stunned by the scene before her. Mrs. Watson and Anne stood at the counter, guiding Miguel and Carmen through the process of making pancakes. Nicolas sat at the table, solemnly stirring a bowl of what appeared to be whipped cream, his face spotted with white evidence of his sampling. Senor Gato observed the proceedings from his perch on the windowsill, tail twitching with feline judgment. "Mommy!" Carmen exclaimed, her face lighting up. "We're making you breakfast. It's a surprise." "I can see that," Teresa replied, her throat tight with emotion at this simple domestic scene. Her children engaged in normal, happy childhood activities under the watchful eyes of surrogate grandmothers. "It looks delicious." "Sit, sit," Mrs. Watson instructed, ushering Teresa to a chair. "The children wanted to thank you properly before the moving chaos begins." As she sipped the coffee Anne placed before her and watched Miguel carefully flip a pancake under Mrs. Watson's guidance, Teresa felt something shift within her, a softening of the hardened shell she had developed to survive their difficult circumstances. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine not just surviving but thriving, creating a life for her children filled with these kinds of ordinary pleasures. After breakfast, the work of packing resumed. Teresa had so few possessions that the process went quickly, especially with Anne's organizational skills and Mrs. Watson's supply of boxes saved from decades of catalogue shopping. By early afternoon, everything was ready for the next day's move. "Why don't you take the children to see the Christmas displays downtown?" Anne suggested, as they surveyed the neatly labeled boxes stacked in the corner of Mrs. Watson's living room. "Mom and I have some paperwork to go through for her move, and you all could use a break from these four walls." Teresa hesitated, mentally calculating the cost of bus fare and the inevitable requests for treats that such an outing would inspire. As if reading her thoughts, Anne pressed some folded bills into her hand. "Consider it an early Christmas gift," she said firmly when Teresa began to protest. "Mom and I would come too, but her knees aren't up to all that walking. Bring us back some of those roasted nuts from the Christmas market, the cinnamon ones." And so, bundled against the December chill, Teresa led her excited children onto the bus that would take them downtown. The city had transformed itself for the holidays, the usual grime and grey concealed beneath twinkling lights and festive decorations. As they walked hand in hand down State Street, gazing at the elaborate window displays of Marshall Fields, Teresa found herself caught up in her children's wonder. "Look, Mummy," Carmen pointed to a mechanical scene of elves wrapping presents in Santa's workshop. "They're just like us when we were helping pack the boxes." "I want to be that one," Nicolas declared, indicating an elf operating a toy train. Set, his earlier illness forgotten in the excitement of the outing, Miguel, always more reserved, was nonetheless visibly captivated by a display featuring a miniature Chicago, complete with a tiny elevated train circling a Christmas tree representing the downtown skyline. "Can we ride the real L train someday, Mummy?" he asked, eyes following the model train's path. "All the way around? Not just one stop, but the whole circle?" Teresa, watching her son's face brighten with a simple dream that seemed so achievable, nodded. "Yes, mijo. Once we're settled in our new place, we'll take a day just for that." the whole circle, and maybe stop for hot chocolate downtown. They continued their exploration, wandering through Millennium Park, where the massive Cloud Gate sculpture, the bean, as Chicagoans called it, reflected their small family in its curved surface, distorting and multiplying their images until they seemed part of something larger, a kaleidoscope of humanity bound together by shared wonder. Teresa took a rare moment to simply exist in the joy of the present, pushing away thoughts of tomorrow's move and all the uncertainties that still lay ahead. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the newly fallen snow, they made their way to the Christmas market in Daly Plaza. The scent of roasted nuts, mulled cider, and sausages filled the air as vendors called out their wares from wooden stalls decorated with evergreen boughs and twinkling lights. "Remember, we're just buying nuts for Mrs. Watson and Anne," Teresa reminded her children as they entered the bustling market. "No extras." But when Nicholas pressed his face against the glass of a stall selling handcrafted wooden toys, his eyes, wide with longing at the sight of a small, painted train set, Teresa found her resolve weakening. It was modestly priced. The vendor had marked it down as Christmas approached, and she had the unexpected money from Mrs. Logan's bonus. Before she could talk herself out of it, she had purchased the toy, tucking it quickly into her bag, as Nicholas was distracted by Carmen's discovery of a stall selling hot chocolate. The market was growing more crowded as evening approached and locals stopped in after work. Teresa kept a firm grip on Nicholas's hand, with Carmen holding his other hand and Miguel leading the way through the throng toward the nut vendor Anne had recommended. They had nearly reached it when a voice called out over the noise of the crowd, "Teresa! Teresa Martinez!" She turned, momentarily confused, and then felt a rush of recognition and warmth. Eduardo, the man approaching them, was Lena's son, tall, broad-shouldered, with his mother's kind eyes and quick smile. He worked as a mechanic, if Teresa remembered correctly from Lena's frequent proud updates, and had recently been promoted to shop manager. "I thought that was you," Eduardo said, catching up to them. "Mom's been worried sick since she heard about what happened at your building." She tried calling, but the number was disconnected. Teresa felt a pang of guilt. In the chaos of the past week, she had forgotten to inform Lena of their situation. "I'm so sorry. Things happened so quickly. We're staying with a neighbor until tomorrow, and then moving to a new place. I changed my number for safety." Eduardo nodded in understanding. "Mom figured it was something like that. She's been lighting candles for you and the kids every night." He crouched down to Miguel's level. "And you must be the man of the house I've heard so much about. Your abuela Lena says you're the best big brother in Chicago." Miguel's chest puffed slightly at this adult acknowledgement of his role, though he remained characteristically reserved. "Nice to meet you, sir." "Sir?" Eduardo laughed, standing again. "Listen to those manners. Your mama is raising you right." He turned back to Teresa. "Seriously, though, Mom would kill me if I ran into you and didn't get your new contact information. She needs her Teresa updates." The simple affirmation that she mattered to someone outside of her immediate family, that Lena considered her, not just a co-worker, but a friend worth worrying about, warmed Teresa even more than the cup of cider she had splurged on for the family to share. She wrote her new number on the back of a market flyer, adding the address of Mrs. Watson's building. "We move in tomorrow," she explained. "It's much better than where we were, safer, warmer." "That's great news," Eduardo said, pocketing the paper. "Listen, I've got my truck here. Can I help with the move, save you the cost of a moving service?" Teresa hadn't even considered hiring movers. She had been planning to make multiple trips on the bus with their few possessions, but the offer of transportation was too practical to refuse out of pride. "That would be—" "Thank you, Eduardo. That's very kind." They arranged to meet at Mrs. Watson's the following morning, and then Eduardo was swallowed by the crowd, leaving Teresa with a strange, lingering sense of community that she hadn't felt since leaving her hometown in Mexico nearly a decade before. Chicago had always seemed a city of strangers, each person locked in their own private struggles. But perhaps, she reflected as she purchased the promised cinnamon nuts for Mrs. Watson and Anne, she had been too focused on survival to notice the connections forming around her like delicate threads, gradually weaving into something that might, with care, become a safety net. The children were exhausted by the time they returned to Mrs. Watson's apartment, their cheeks flushed from cold and excitement. After a simple dinner, Teresa bathed them and tucked them into bed, where they fell asleep almost immediately, their dreams undoubtedly filled with the magical sights of the day. "They look happy," Anne observed from the doorway as Teresa adjusted Nicholas's blankets. "You're doing a remarkable job, Teresa, especially under such difficult circumstances." Teresa closed the door softly behind them before responding. "Sometimes I think I'm failing them, that if I were a better mother, they wouldn't have to know about things like eviction notices, or hiding from their father, or choosing between new shoes and the electric bill." Anne led her to the kitchen, where Mrs. Watson was preparing tea. "That's not failure," the older woman said firmly, having overheard the conversation. "That's life dealing you a difficult hand, and you playing it with grace and determination. The children are clean, well-mannered, and most importantly, secure in your love. Everything else is just circumstance." Teresa accepted the cup of tea, letting its warmth seep into her hands. "When Raoul first left, I was so angry," she admitted. "Not just at him, but at God, at the world, at myself for not seeing the signs earlier. I kept thinking, why me? Why us? As if suffering were something unusual, something I alone had been singled out for." "And now?" Anne asked gently. Teresa considered the question. "Now I understand that everyone carries something. Mrs. Logan with her perfect house and her designer clothes. She confided in me once that her marriage is empty, that her husband hasn't spoken to her with real affection in years. Lena at the factory, raising grandchildren because her daughter is struggling with the same demons that took Raoul. Even Victor Diaz, who lived alone and spoke to no one. He must have had his reasons for isolation." She took a sip of tea, organizing her thoughts. "I still get angry sometimes, still have moments of self-pity, but mostly I try to focus on what we do have, not what we've lost. The children are healthy, I have work, and now, thanks to you, both, we have a safe place to live. That's more than many can say." Mrs. Watson reached across the table to pat Teresa's hand. "That's wisdom, my dear, the kind that usually takes much longer to acquire." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, three women from different generations and backgrounds, united by a shared understanding of life's complexities and the strength required to navigate them. "Eduardo, Lena's son, offered to help with the move tomorrow," Teresa said finally, "with his truck. It's funny how things work out sometimes." "Lena's son?" Mrs. Watson's eyebrows rose slightly. "The handsome mechanic she's always trying to set single women up with?" Teresa felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I don't know about that. I've never met him before today. We just happened to run into each other at the Christmas market." "Happened to run into each other," Mrs. Watson repeated, with a knowing smile. "In a city of nearly 3 million people. That's quite a coincidence." "Mother," Anne chided gently, "don't embarrass Teresa. She has enough on her plate without your matchmaking." But Teresa didn't mind the teasing. After years of viewing men with suspicion, a natural consequence of Raoul's betrayal and subsequent behavior, it was refreshing to be reminded that not all male attention was dangerous or unwelcome. Not that she was interested in Eduardo or any man at this point in her life. Her focus remained firmly on stability for her children, on building the safe and nurturing home they deserved. Still, As she prepared for bed that night, setting out clothes for the move and checking her meager savings against the list of expenses for the coming month, Teresa allowed herself a moment of purely feminine vanity. Perhaps she would wear her good jeans tomorrow, the ones that still fit well despite years of wash and wear, and maybe the blue sweater that Lena always said brought out the warmth in her complexion, not for Eduardo's benefit, of course, simply because tomorrow marked a new beginning, and new beginnings deserved to be honored with one's best appearance. What would you think if your friend or a family member suddenly faced a situation like Teresa's? How would you help them? Please, share your thoughts in the comments. Morning dawned bright and clear, the winter sun casting a golden light across the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Teresa woke early, excited and anxious in equal measure. Today marked not just a physical move, but a symbolic one, a step away from the fear and instability that had characterized their lives since Raoul's departure, towards something that felt cautiously like hope. The children caught her mood, rushing through breakfast and bouncing with anticipation as they helped with final preparations. Even Mrs. Watson and Anne seemed infected by the energy, moving with unusual briskness as they packed the last few items and prepared a simple lunch for the movers. Eduardo had called to say he was bringing a friend to help with the heavier furniture. "I still can't believe you're leaving all this for us," Teresa said to Mrs. Watson as they folded linens together, the familiar domestic task a counterpoint to the significance of the day. "Believe it," Mrs. Watson replied firmly. "Anne and I have discussed it thoroughly, and it's the right decision for everyone. These things have served their purpose in my life. Now they can serve yours. When you're settled and back on your feet, you'll do the same for someone else. That's how the world should work, don't you think?" Before Teresa could respond, there was a knock at the door. Anne opened it to reveal Eduardo, accompanied by a shorter, stockier man he introduced as his cousin Pablo. "Sorry we're a bit early," Eduardo apologized, removing his hat as he entered. "We wanted to beat the worst of the holiday traffic." Teresa, suddenly self-conscious in her good jeans and blue sweater, managed a smile that she hoped appeared merely friendly rather than nervous. "We're ready. Thank you again for doing this." The process of moving went more smoothly than Teresa had dared to hope. Eduardo and Pablo worked efficiently, carrying boxes and furniture down to the truck with professional ease. By noon, everything had been transported from Mrs. Watson's apartment to the one Teresa would now call home, just one floor above. As Pablo made a final trip to retrieve Señor Gato's litter box, Eduardo paused in the doorway of what would be the children's bedroom, where Teresa was making up beds with Mrs. Watson's linens. "My mom wanted me to ask you something," he said, his tone casual but his expression carefully neutral. "She's hosting a small gathering on Christmas Day, just family and a few close friends. She'd like you and the children to come if you're free." Teresa smoothed a wrinkle from the bedspread, buying time as she considered the invitation. The thought of spending Christmas among strangers was slightly intimidating, but the alternative was their first holiday alone in a new apartment, with memories of better times before Raoul's addiction had taken him from them, hovering like unwelcome ghosts. "That's very kind of her," Teresa said finally. "We'd be honored to come. Should I bring something? I make good tamales." Eduardo's face brightened with a genuine smile. "Mom would love that. She always says no one makes them like you do. She talks about you a lot, you know. Says you're the hardest worker at the factory and the one with the most natural talent for sewing." The compliment warmed Teresa unexpectedly. She had always viewed her job as merely a means of survival, not a venue for recognition or praise. "Your mother is too generous." "No," Eduardo said, holding her gaze with unexpected seriousness. "She's just honest. It's one of her best qualities." The moment was interrupted by Nicolas's excited shriek from the living room, where he had discovered that Senor Gato had emerged from hiding and was now exploring his new territory with feline dignity. By late afternoon, the move was complete. Eduardo and Pablo had refused payment, accepting only the lunch Anne had prepared and Teresa's promise to come to Lena's Christmas gathering. As she walked them to the door, Teresa felt a confusing mix of relief at the completion of the task and regret at their departure. "Thank you," she said again, the words inadequate for the day's work, but all she had to offer. "I don't know how I would have managed without your help." "That's what community is for," Eduardo replied simply. Then, with a slight hesitation that suggested the words had not been planned, "I'll pick you up on Christmas Day. Around 2? The roads might be bad, and it's on the way for me anyway." Teresa found herself accepting the offer before pride could intervene with objections about bus schedules and independence. There was a difference, she was learning, between self-reliance and isolation, a lesson that Raoul's abandonment had obscured, but which Mrs. Watson's generosity and now Eduardo's simple kindness were gradually teaching her to recognize again. After they had gone, Teresa stood in the center of what was now her living room, taking in the space that still carried echoes of Mrs. Watson's life, but would soon bear the imprint of her own family's existence. The apartment was modest by most standards: a living room with a small adjoining dining area, a compact kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom that needed updating. But compared to their previous accommodations, it felt palatial. The windows were well sealed against drafts. The heating system worked without the alarming clanks and groans they had become accustomed to, and most importantly, the neighborhood was safer, the building more secure. "Do you like it?" Teresa asked, gathering her children close as they surveyed their new domain. "It's the best house ever," Nicolas declared, still trailing Senor Gato with hopeful persistence. "It's nice," Carmen agreed, already eyeing the small desk in the corner, that Mrs. Watson had used for correspondence, but which would now serve as a homework station. "And quiet, I can't hear the trains." Miguel characteristically took longer to respond, his serious eyes taking in every detail of the space as if committing it to memory. "It feels like a real home," he said finally, "like we could stay here a long time." Teresa hugged him close, recognizing in his hesitant approval the same cautious hope she herself felt, the fear of attaching too quickly to something that might, like so much in their lives, prove temporary. "We will stay," she promised, infusing her voice with a certainty she was determined to make reality. "This is our home now." Those were the days before Christmas. The neighborhood was much quieter than their previous one, with fewer people on. The streets and a general atmosphere of orderly calm that contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy of the area they had left. Teresa spent the time settling into the apartment, arranging their few possessions among Mrs. Watson's more substantial furnishings, creating a hybrid space that reflected both the elderly woman's lifetime of careful acquisitions and Teresa's own more minimalist aesthetic born of necessity. The children, released from school for the holiday break, explored their new environment with mounting excitement. Miguel appointed himself Nicholas's protector during these expeditions, while Carmen quickly identified the best sledding hills in the nearby park and made tentative overtures of friendship to a girl about her age who lived in the building. Teresa, meanwhile, gradually relaxed into the unfamiliar sensation of security. For the first time in years, she found herself sleeping through the night without starting awake at every sound, convinced it was Raoul returning in a drug-induced rage or the landlord coming to evict them for late payment. She cooked in the well-maintained kitchen with growing confidence, using some of Mrs. Watson's recipes left behind in a neatly organized box. She even began to plan small improvements she might make over time, curtains she could sew from factory, remnants, a coat of paint for the children's room when she had saved enough. On Christmas Eve, Teresa took the children to Mass at the small Catholic church near their new home. The service, conducted in both English and Spanish, filled her with a sense of connection to her heritage that she had sometimes let slip in the daily struggle for survival in a new country. As the familiar prayers and hymns washed over her, Teresa found herself offering thanks not just for their improved circumstances, but for the lessons of the difficult years, the strength she had discovered within herself, the resilience her children had developed, the value of authentic kindness exemplified by Mrs. Watson, Anne, and now Lena and Eduardo. Returning home through gently falling snow, the children walking ahead of her engaged in an impromptu game of catch with snowballs. Teresa felt a peace she had almost forgotten was possible. When they reached the apartment, she prepared hot chocolate and set out cookies Mrs. Watson had baked before departing for Denver 2 days earlier. Then she allowed the children to open one gift each, a Christmas Eve tradition from her own childhood. In Mexico, Carmen received a set of colored pencils and a drawing pad. Miguel, a book about trains that Teresa had found at a second-hand store and carefully repaired. And Nicholas, a stuffed bear that had belonged to Mrs. Watson's granddaughter, but which had been left behind years ago and rediscovered during the move. Teresa had washed and mended it, replacing one button eye and adding a red bow tie fashioned from ribbon left over from wrapping the other gifts. Watching them exclaim over these modest presents, Teresa felt a momentary pang of inadequacy. Other children would receive so much more tomorrow. But the feeling passed quickly as she observed their genuine pleasure, unmarred by comparisons or unfulfilled expectations. Her children had learned early what many never grasped, that joy was not measured in possessions, but in connections, not in quantity, but in meaning. After the children were in bed, Teresa sat alone in the living room, a single lamp illuminating the small space. Tomorrow would bring new experiences. The gathering at Lena's, the first Christmas in their new home, the continued adjustment to changed circumstances. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, Teresa allowed herself to fully acknowledge how far they had come and to nurture the fragile hope that had begun to grow within her. They were not just surviving now, they were beginning to live again. Morning dawned with the magical quality that Christmas seems to bestow even on ordinary landscapes. The children woke early, their excitement palpable as they gathered around. The small tree that Teresa had purchased from a lot selling discounted specimens on Christmas Eve. Beneath it lay the wrapped gifts she had prepared, the wooden train set for Nicholas, a hand-sewn doll for Carmen that Teresa had worked on during late nights, and for Miguel, a model kit for building a miniature version of Chicago's elevated train. "Santa came!" Nicholas exclaimed, eyes wide with wonder as he spotted the packages. Teresa exchanged a glance with Miguel, who at 8 was beginning to harbor doubts about Santa's existence, but maintained the pretense for his younger siblings' benefit. There was something deeply touching about his willingness to preserve their innocence, even as his own had been compromised by their difficult circumstances. "Let's see what he brought," Teresa encouraged, settling on the floor beside them as they tore into the wrapping paper with delighted abandon. Their joy, so complete, so unrestrained, filled the apartment with a warmth that had nothing to do with the efficient heating system. Teresa watched them examine their gifts, exclaiming over details and immediately engaging in play, and felt a contentment that transcended the financial limitations that had constrained her shopping. These simple toys, chosen with knowledge of each child's individual interests and personality, represented not just material objects, but evidence of her attention, her understanding, her love. Later, as she prepared the tamales for Lena's gathering, while the children played with their new possessions, Teresa reflected on the strange and winding path that had led them to this moment. A year ago, they had still been living with Raúl, witnessing his gradual descent into addiction's grip, experiencing the first tremors of the upheaval that would eventually force them to flee. 6 months ago, they had been in the apartment where violence had eventually followed them, living day to day with the knowledge that security was an illusion that could shatter at any moment. And now, here they were, in a safe home, surrounded by an expanding circle of support, facing a future that, while still challenging, no longer seemed hopeless. The journey had been painful, marked by losses that still ached when Teresa allowed herself to dwell on them. But it had also revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed and connections she hadn't expected to form. The arrival of Eduardo's truck, announced by a gentle knock at precisely 2 o'clock, pulled Teresa from her reflections. As the children scrambled for coats and boots, she found herself checking her appearance one final time in the small mirror. By the door, a gesture that would have seemed frivolous only weeks before, but which now felt like a reclamation of something essential that hardship had temporarily suppressed. Eduardo greeted them with the same easy warmth he'd displayed during the move, complimenting the children on their Christmas outfits. Clothes that Teresa had carefully selected from those Mrs. Logan had given them, altering them where necessary, to ensure a proper fit. He helped load them into his truck, making sure Nicolas's booster seat was secure before closing the door with a flourish that made the little boy giggle. "You look nice," he said to Teresa, as they pulled away from the curb. The observation offered casually, but with an undercurrent of genuine appreciation that made her cheeks warm despite the winter chill. "Thank you," she replied, focusing intently on adjusting her seatbelt to avoid meeting his gaze. "Your mother has been so kind to invite us. I hope we won't be imposing on a family occasion." Eduardo laughed, the sound rich and unguarded. "You clearly don't know my mother very well yet. She collects people the way some women collect ceramic figurines. Half the guests at these gatherings aren't related to us by blood, but they're family all the same. She has a gift for creating connections." As they drove through streets transformed by snow into a winter wonderland, Teresa found herself relaxing into the conversation, drawn out by Eduardo's gentle questions about the move, the children's adjustment to the new apartment, her hopes for the transfer to a different school after the holiday break. His interest seemed genuine, his attention focused despite the distractions of driving and the children's excited chatter from the back seat. Lena's home was a modest but well-maintained bungalow on the western edge of the city, its exterior festooned with colorful lights that blinked a cheerful welcome as they approached. Inside, the atmosphere was one of controlled chaos, delicious aromas emanating from the kitchen where several women worked together preparing the feast, children of various ages racing through rooms decorated with a mix of traditional American and Mexican Christmas symbols, men gathered around a television watching a football game whose significance Teresa didn't understand, but which appeared to inspire passionate debate. "Teresa!" Lena emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron already stained with evidence of the day's cooking. She enveloped Teresa in a warm embrace before crouching to greet the children at their level. "And these must be the famous Martinez children I've heard so much about. Come in, come in. There are cookies in the dining room and other children to play with. Eduardo, take their coats and then help your uncle with the table extension. More people are coming than we expected." Before Teresa could feel overwhelmed by the bustling activity, Lena linked arms with her and led her toward the kitchen. "I want you to meet everyone. You've been alone too long, mihija. That ends today." The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions, conversations carried out in a fluid mix of Spanish and English, and shared activities that required no common language at all. Teresa found herself kneading dough alongside Lena's sister-in-law, laughing at family stories translated in real time by whoever happened to be bilingual and nearby, and watching with a full heart as her children were seamlessly incorporated into games and traditions that had been ongoing for generations. Miguel, typically reserved, had found a kindred spirit in Lena's grandson Mateo, a serious 9-year-old who shared his interest in trains and had brought him into a complex game, involving tracks built of rolled blankets and chairs, repurposed as tunnels and stations. Carmen was in the midst of a group of girls who had welcomed her artistic talents, engaging her in creating paper snowflakes to add to the already abundant decorations. And Nicolas, always the most adaptable, had been adopted by a teenage girl, who carried him on her hip as she moved through the house, introducing him to relatives and friends with the pride of temporary guardianship. "They fit right in," Eduardo observed, appearing at Teresa's side with a cup of hot chocolate topped with the cinnamon whipped cream that was apparently a house specialty. "Like they've always been part of the family." Teresa accepted the drink, gratefully, warmed not just by its temperature, but by the sentiment behind the observation. "Your mother has created something special here," she said, gesturing to the room where different languages, ages, and backgrounds blended into a harmonious whole. "It's not just a gathering, it's a community. She believes that family is something you create, not just something you're born into," Eduardo replied, his eyes following the path of his young niece who was still carrying Nicolas on her rounds. "That the people who stand by you when things are difficult are your true family, regardless of blood." The words resonated deeply with Teresa, echoing her own evolving understanding of connection and support. For too long after Raoul's departure, she had viewed their small unit of 4, reduced to 3 by his absence, as isolated, set apart from others by circumstance and necessity. Now she was beginning to recognize that isolation had been a choice, not an inevitability, a protective measure that had served its purpose, but which could be gradually relinquished as safety and trust were re-established. Dinner, when it was finally served, was a magnificent fusion of culinary traditions: turkey and tamales, mashed potatoes and mole, apple pie and flan. Teresa's contribution was received with enthusiasm, Lena declaring her tamales even better than mine. And I don't say that lightly. The compliment, offered publicly and with genuine admiration, filled Teresa with a pride she hadn't felt in years, not just in her cooking, which had always been a source of satisfaction, but in her identity as someone who could contribute meaningfully to a community. As the evening progressed, Teresa found herself drawn into conversations that ranged from the practical, advice on navigating the school system from mothers who had done it successfully, to the deeply personal stories of immigration, adaptation, and resilience that paralleled her own experiences in many ways. Here were women who had faced challenges similar to hers and emerged not just intact but strengthened, their hard-won wisdom offered now as a guide for her own journey. Throughout it all, she was aware of Eduardo's presence, sometimes nearby, sometimes across the room, but always seeming to maintain a gentle awareness of her comfort and inclusion. He translated when necessary, introduced topics he thought might interest her, and ensured that her cup was never empty and her plate always full. His attentions were unobtrusive but consistent, suggesting a consideration that went beyond mere hospitality to something more personal. As the celebration began to wind down, with younger children growing drowsy and older guests departing with warm embraces and promises of future gatherings, Teresa found herself on the small back porch with Eduardo, watching as the last of the day's light faded from the sky, replaced by the glow of the city reflected against low-hanging clouds. "Thank you for including us today," she said softly, her breath visible in the cold air. It meant more than I can express, especially for the children. Eduardo, leaning against the porch railing beside her, nodded in understanding. They're great kids. You've done an amazing job with them, especially considering everything you've been through. The simple acknowledgement of her struggles and her efforts to overcome them touched Teresa deeply. For so long, she had carried her burdens silently, presenting a face of capability to the world that masked the fear and exhaustion beneath. To be seen, truly seen, in both her challenges and her triumphs, felt like a gift more precious than any material offering. It hasn't been easy, she admitted, the words emerging more freely than she would have expected. There were days when I wasn't sure we would make it, when the only thing keeping me going was knowing the children needed me. Eduardo turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light. But you did make it, and not just survived, you protected them, kept them together, gave them stability and love in impossible circumstances. That's not just being a good mother, Teresa. That's being a hero. You. Teresa shook her head, embarrassed by the praise but moved by its sincerity. I'm not a hero. I'm just a mother doing what any mother would do for her children. No. Eduardo's voice was gentle but firm. Not every mother would have found the strength you did. Some would have broken under the pressure, turned to destructive coping mechanisms, or given up the children when things got too hard. I've seen it happen, in my own extended family and in the neighborhood where I grew up. What you've done, keeping your family together, maintaining your dignity and values through everything, that's exceptional. Before Teresa could respond, the door opened behind them, spilling light and warmth onto the porch. Lena appeared, holding a sleepy Nicholas in her arms. I think your little ones are ready to head home, she said with a smile that held both understanding and invitation. But you'll come back soon, yes? Sunday dinner, perhaps, and the children can play with their new friends again. We'd like that very much, Teresa replied, realizing as she spoke that she truly meant it, that the prospect of regular connection with this extended family of choice filled her with anticipation rather than anxiety. The drive home was quiet, the children drowsy from food and play, the streets of Chicago transformed by night and snow into a peaceful landscape far removed from the harsh realities that had dominated their lives for so long. As Eduardo's truck pulled up in front of their building, Teresa found herself reluctant for the evening to end, for this sense of inclusion and warmth to give way to the solitude of their apartment, however improved it might be from their previous home. I'll help you get them upstairs, Eduardo offered, correctly interpreting her hesitation as practical rather than emotional. They looked too tired to walk. Together, they carried the sleeping children to the apartment, Teresa unlocking the door while Eduardo held Nicolas, then settling each child into bed without fully waking them. The domesticity of the scene, a man and woman working in quiet harmony to tend to sleeping children, struck Teresa with unexpected force, a vision of normalcy that had seemed permanently beyond her reach in the aftermath of Raoul's betrayal. Thank you again, she said, as they stood at the door, the evening finally drawing to its inevitable close. For everything, the move, the dinner, carrying the children. You and your family have been so kind to us. Eduardo's smile held a warmth that seemed to illuminate the space between them. It's been a pleasure, Teresa, truly, and I hope this is just the beginning of a friendship between our families. The word friendship hung in the air between them, its potential meanings both clear and ambiguous. Teresa, still cautious, after all she had endured, nodded without committing herself to a specific interpretation. I'd like that, she said simply. The children would too. Eduardo seemed to understand both what she was saying and what she was holding back. One step at a time, he agreed. But steps forward, not backward. That's what's important. As he descended the stairs, Teresa closed the door softly, leaning against it for a moment in the quiet of the apartment. Outside, the city continued its nighttime rhythm. Distant traffic, occasional voices, the hum of urban existence. But inside, in this space that was rapidly becoming home, Teresa felt a sense of possibility that had been absent from her life for too long. It was too soon to know what form that possibility might take, whether Eduardo would remain simply a kind acquaintance, become a friend, or perhaps someday something more. It was too soon to predict whether their improved circumstances would last, or what new challenges might arise as the children grew. The future, as always, remained unwritten, subject to forces beyond her control. But tonight, standing in the home that had come to them through an unexpected chain of kindness and connection, Teresa allowed herself to believe that whatever came next, they would not face it alone. That the isolation which had defined their struggle was giving way to community, that the careful walls she had built around her heart for protection might gradually be lowered without inviting destruction. It was, she realized, the greatest gift she could have received this Christmas. Not security or comfort, though these were precious, but hope. Hope for herself, and most importantly, hope for her children, who deserved a future brightened by possibility rather than shadowed by fear. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake unique and fragile, yet part of a blanket that would transform the landscape by morning. Teresa watched it for a moment through the window, then turned away to check on her sleeping children one last time before retiring herself. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges and opportunities, but tonight, in this moment, all was peaceful. All was well. The winter that followed brought its share of both difficulties and joys as Teresa and her children settled into their new life. There were adjustments to be made. A new school for the children with different expectations and routines, a longer commute to the factory for Teresa, the practical challenges of managing a household in an unfamiliar neighborhood. But these were balanced by improvements that made the struggles worthwhile. Better teachers who recognized and encouraged Miguel's natural intelligence and Carmen's artistic talents. Neighbors who watched out for one another rather than turning a blind eye to trouble. A building superintendent who actually fixed things when they broke instead of offering excuses and delays. Most significant, perhaps, was the expanding circle of connections that gradually transformed Teresa's sense of isolation into one of belonging. Sunday dinners at Lena's became a regular fixture in their lives, a weekly reminder that family could be chosen as well as inherited. Mrs. Watson called, often from Denver, her affection for Teresa and the children undiminished by distance, and Eduardo. Eduardo moved carefully, respectfully into their lives with a patience that spoke volumes about his character. He took the children sledding on weekends when Teresa worked extra shifts at the factory. He helped Miguel with a school project about building an elevated train model, offering suggestions that enhanced the boy's design while respecting his vision. He fixed the temperamental sink in their kitchen when the superintendent was away for a weekend, and gradually, with small gestures and quiet conversations, he began to court Teresa herself, not with grandiose promises or intense pressure, but with consistent kindness and growing affection that asked nothing in return except the space to develop naturally. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, melting the snow that had insulated their lives through the winter months. As temperatures rose, Teresa discovered new facets of their neighborhood. A community garden where Carmen volunteered alongside elderly residents who delighted in her enthusiasm. A small library within walking distance where Miguel spent hours exploring books beyond his grade level. A playground where Nicolas made friends with children from diverse backgrounds, absorbing new words and customs with the effortless adaptability of early childhood. Teresa herself began to flourish in ways that extended beyond mere survival. Lena had recommended her for a position in quality control at the factory, recognizing Teresa's exceptional eye for detail and precision. The promotion came with better hours and slightly higher pay, allowing her to be home when the children returned from school most days. In the evenings, after homework was completed and dinner dishes washed, she began taking English classes at the community center, improving the skills that had previously limited her employment opportunities. Summer brought new changes. Eduardo, whose automotive skills had earned him a reputation beyond his own shop, was offered partnership in a larger business closer to Teresa's neighborhood. The new position meant longer hours temporarily, but greater security and opportunity for advancement. He discussed the decision with Teresa one evening as they sat on a park bench watching the children play, seeking her opinion as if it held particular weight in his considerations. "It would mean I could put down roots here," he explained, his gaze steady on her face. "Build something lasting." Teresa understood the implication beneath his words, that the roots he envisioned might someday intertwine with hers, creating a foundation for a shared future. The thought no longer frightened her as it once would have. Over months of careful interaction, Eduardo had demonstrated repeatedly that he was nothing like Raúl, that his strength was channeled into protection rather than control. His ambition focused on creation rather than escape. His love for she recognized now that it was indeed love developing between them, expressed through respect rather than possession. "I think you should accept," she said simply. "It sounds like the right next step." The smile that illuminated his face conveyed understanding of all she wasn't yet ready to say explicitly, but had begun to feel with increasing certainty. Fall brought the children's first full year in their new school, where both Miguel and Carmen were placed in advanced programs that challenged their natural abilities. Nicolas started kindergarten, his English now fluent, though still flavored, with the musical cadence of his native Spanish. Teresa, watching him march confidently into the classroom on the first day, marveled at his resilience, how quickly he had adapted to their improved circumstances, how completely he had embraced their new community. As the months passed, Teresa gradually allowed Eduardo to become more integrated into their family life. He joined them for dinner regularly, teaching the boys how to fix things around the apartment and listening with genuine interest to Carmen's increasingly sophisticated artwork explanations. He respected Teresa's boundaries, never staying too late or assuming privileges not explicitly granted, his patience a balm to her still healing heart. By the time their second Christmas in the apartment approached, Teresa had made the space truly their own. Mrs. Watson's furniture remained, but Teresa had added personal touches, curtains sewn from fabrics chosen with care, walls painted in warm colors on weekends when Eduardo volunteered to entertain the children, framed artwork created by Carmen, and school certificates earned by Miguel proudly displayed. Even Señor Gato had fully acclimated, claiming favorite perches and demanding affection with the entitled confidence of a creature who knows it is home. The holiday preparations this year carried none of the desperation of previous celebrations. Teresa could afford modest but thoughtful gifts for each child without sacrificing necessities. Decorations were placed with care rather than haste. And when Eduardo asked if he might join them for Christmas Eve dinner before they all attended Lena's gathering the following day, Teresa found herself agreeing with a sense of rightness that surprised her with its completeness. He arrived bearing gifts that demonstrated his attention to each family member's interests and needs, art supplies for Carmen that Teresa had mentioned once in passing, a more advanced train book for Miguel, a sturdy truck for Nicolas that could withstand rough and play, and for Teresa herself, a simple silver bracelet whose delicate beauty brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "It's too much," she protested as he fastened it around her wrist. It's exactly enough, he countered gently, for all you've overcome, for all you've built for your family. Later, after the children were in bed and the apartment was quiet, except for the soft music playing from the radio, Teresa and Eduardo sat together on the sofa, the small tree's lights casting a warm glow across the room. The moment felt suspended between past and future, a pause in which possibilities hovered, waiting to be acknowledged. "I've been thinking," Eduardo began, his voice carrying a note of careful consideration that told Teresa this was something he had planned rather than an impulse, about next steps, about the future. Teresa felt her heart quicken, but kept her expression neutral, allowing him space to continue without presumption. "I know it hasn't been easy for you to trust again after what happened with Raoul," he went on. "I know the children are your priority, as they should be, and I know you value your independence, the life you've built on your own terms." He turned slightly to face her more directly, his expression serious but warm. "I don't want to change any of that, Teresa. I don't want to replace what you've created or take control of decisions that are rightfully yours. What I want, what I hope for, is to be part of the journey with you, to support you and the children, to share in your lives, to build something together that's stronger than what any of us could create alone." Teresa studied his face, reading there the sincerity that had characterized all their interactions. "Are you proposing, Eduardo?" she asked directly, her own relationship with honesty too valued now to sidestep the question. He smiled, appreciating her straightforwardness. "Not yet, not formally. I think we both need more time before that step, but I am asking if you're open to the possibility of a future together. If you could see yourself someday, considering me as more than a friend. To your family." Teresa had expected to feel fear at such a conversation, the old panic that had accompanied any thought of renewed vulnerability after Raoul's betrayal. Instead, she felt a calm certainty, a recognition that this man sitting beside her represented not risk but opportunity, not danger but safety. "I'm already there," she admitted softly. "You became more than a friend to us months ago, Eduardo. I just needed time to be sure, to trust my judgment again." "And now?" he asked, hope evident in his voice but restrained by respect for her process. "Now I think we're ready for next steps," Teresa replied, reaching for his hand with newfound confidence. "Not rushing but moving forward together, seeing where this path leads us." The kiss they shared was gentle, a promise rather than a demand, a beginning rather than a conclusion. When they parted, Teresa felt none of the anxiety she had feared might accompany such intimacy, only a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place that had long been separate. "Merry Christmas, Teresa," Eduardo murmured, his eyes reflecting the soft lights of the tree and something more, a future taking shape between them, built on mutual respect and genuine caring. "Merry Christmas," she replied, allowing herself to lean slightly against his shoulder, accepting the support he offered while maintaining her own strength. It was, she realized, a perfect metaphor for the relationship they were building, neither dependent nor distant, but interdependent, connected but whole. Outside, snow began to fall again, a benediction on the city that had proven both crucible and cradle for Teresa's journey. Inside, in the home that had come to her through an unbroken chain of kindness, she watched the gentle descent of flakes and recognized them as symbols of her own transformation, each seemingly fragile, yet possessing remarkable resilience, each unique, yet part of a greater pattern, each falling but ultimately rising again as part of the endless cycle of renewal. Teresa Martinez had entered the hardest period of her life with little more than her name and her will to survive. A battered stove, a mattress on the floor, and a curtain instead of a door. That had been her home, but to her children it had been a fortress, a place where love meant more than comfort. She had worked from dawn to dusk, washing clothes in buckets, scrubbing floors on her knees, selling pastries under the sun, anything to keep her boys away from the streets that swallowed other children like shadows. She had seen it every day, mothers crying for sons lost to violence, to drugs, to hopelessness, and every night she had whispered to herself, "Not mine, not while I'm breathing." People had laughed. "You think love fills an empty belly? Discipline won't keep them from gangs." But she hadn't flinched. She had raised them with stories instead of toys, with rules instead of excuses, with pride instead of pity. There had been days when the pot was empty, but their hearts were full. Years had passed, and now her children were thriving, honest, hard-working, kind. Miguel excelling in school with dreams of becoming an engineer. Carmen developing her artistic talents with increasing confidence. Nicholas growing straight and strong, untouched by the shadows that had threatened them all. And Teresa herself, evolving from survival to growth, from isolation to connection, from fear to hope. Now, with Eduardo beside her and a community surrounding them, Teresa looked toward the future with a peace she had fought hard to achieve. The journey had not been easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But she had proven to herself and to her children that with determination, courage, and the willingness to accept help when offered in genuine kindness, even the darkest circumstances could lead to light. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all, one she hoped her children would carry with them throughout their lives. That hardship, while painful, could forge strength, that community once found could sustain hope, and that love, properly tended, could transform even the most modest shelter into a true and lasting home. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.